Thank you. I'm obviously very honored to be here to speak with you, and thank you to Matthew and the exec committee for inviting me. Brighton obviously is a wonderful town to come to, exciting and beautiful at the same time. I'll speak for about 35 to 40 minutes and then we can have questions before lunch. So I won't keep you away from your lunch for very long, I hope. The PSA has given us a specific form of utopia to consider, the good life. The timing of a conference with this theme could not be more poignant, urgent, and more apposite. As the lives of so many are destroyed by war in Syria, Libya, Iraq, as thousands leave their homes in leaky boats to make hazardous journeys across the Mediterranean to seek the good life elsewhere, it is a moment for us to pause and reflect on what a good life is and what it might be. The images of refugees on our television screens are generating narratives that are based on shifting sands of fear. In the words of the poet C.B. Kavafi, because night has fallen and the barbarians have not come, and some who have just returned from the border say there are no barbarians any longer. And now, what's going to happen to us without barbarians? They were, those people, a kind of a solution. In fearing them, holding them off, containing them, rejecting them, do we erode ourselves, our own imaginaries of the good life? Just as in welcoming them, helping them, working with them, can we build an inclusive world that holds us and them together in a shared good life? So the question that Adorno posed in Minima Moralia is relevant here. Can one lead a good life in a bad life? Or in Judith Butler's words, is it possible to live one's own life well such that we might say that we are living a good life within a world in which the good life is structurally or systematically foreclosed to so many others? So can exploitation, inequality, discrimination, violence, and other forms of effacement coexist with the idea, the imaginary, and the politics of the good life? What is good about the good life, of course, varies. Lives are lived in different registers, with different levels of tolerance, different measures of success and failure, of understandings of production and reproduction, boundaries of safety and security. So can we think about a good life without thinking about whose life that is? What makes for a good life, after all, is rooted in particular landscapes and histories. The horizon that we look to is shaped by the place where we stand. Growing up in pre-liberalized India, in a family of academics who were anti-religion, left-wing, and socially liberal, I lived a good life in a country that was poor in some ways, but very rich in its history and its political life. I was not denied life, as many girls are in rural India, as Amartya Sen's article, 1 Million Girls Are Missing, reminds us. Rather, my birth was celebrated, with telegrams going to family and friends. Apparently, my brother's birth only merited a postcard. I was sent to the best schools and universities, supported at every step in my education and in my professional ambitions. I was brought up with social values that undermined caste and gender as categories of discrimination, where equality among all was espoused and indeed campaigned for, and the world was brought home. Through books, travelers that my father bumped into on his long walks, through campaigners for political causes from the anti-Vietnam War, pro-Palestinian campaigns. There were Cubans when they fought with the Soviets, Chinese when they also fought with the Soviets, foreign academics who visited Delhi University. I remember as a child of 8 sitting on Andrew Gunda Frank's knee as he talked with my parents. It was a good life for me, for a middle-class girl in India, and I could even claim that for a girl anywhere in the world. A good life until for a mere 2 years it was taken away in unexpected and brutal ways. The suspension of civil rights of Indian citizens under the emergency was declared by when the emergency was declared by Mrs. Gandhi in 1975. It was then that I saw what Arendt has called the banality of evil take hold of our lives. When I saw my parents worry about their safety and of their family, when censorship limited communications, thousands went to jail, were dislocated in the name of aestheticizing the city, and whose selfhood was attacked through officially sanctioned forcible sterilization programs. Fear should have no place in a good life. I learned that early, and also learned the euphoria of overthrowing tyranny as millions mobilized against the emergency. So the good life then was remade, at least for the middle classes, in 1977, with the electoral defeat of Mrs. Gandhi and the emergence of many different political parties on the Indian landscape. This change alerted us to the fact that visions of the good life, a democratic and a non-violent life, cannot be taken for granted. Rather, they can spur us on to action in concert with others to change the world we live in. I remember well the jubilant crowds on the streets of Delhi when the election results started rolling in. A collective weight had lifted off the chests of the citizens. We cried, we danced, we hugged strangers as we celebrated together. And yet, I come here from Jawaharlal Nehru University, where I'm visiting professorial fellow, and where the ghost of the emergency was again felt walking the campus. In the name of nationalism, police went on campus, students were arrested, and a vicious campaign against the university and progressive politics launched. But like during the first emergency, this in itself elicited a response that brought many strands of politics and many groups of citizens together against government's oppressive modalities of governance. As my civics teachers used to say, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. But this discourse of eternal vigilance has largely attached itself to the public political, not to the everyday domestic sides of governance. My good life as a girl in growing up in Delhi also depended upon living in a cocoon, of being ferried from place to place either by my parents or school transportation. Unattended entry into the public space, walking to and from the market, for example, could elicit sexual harassment, and for many women, it meant and continues to mean an experience of violence in the public space. The 1980s saw the rise of women's movement in India as women mobilized against state violence. Rape in custody was the trigger then, as well as violence by marital families. Dowry murders elicited huge demonstrations when I was in Delhi University as a student. In the 1990s, when I had already left India for the UK, the liberalization of the economy and the experience of globalization became the important filter through which people thought of the good life. Mass poverty had not been eradicated through a state-dominated, inefficient capitalism. Globalized capital's shining lights beckoned, India shining. Even as we celebrate India as a new power on the rise, the economic and social indicators tell a very mixed picture, and in certain areas, violence against women being one, they are particularly troubling. So, the imaginary of good life needs to bridge the public and the private spheres, a long-standing feminist position, and also individual and collective lives. The good life needs to be a shared good life. So maybe the question we need to ask ourselves is not what is the good life, but what work does the idea of the good life perform in our social, political, and personal milieus. However fragile, however, the value of alternative imaginings is important to recognize. First, without reimaginings, we could become complicit in the reproduction of the dominant norms and values of our unjust world. Unless we are able to challenge the lives we live through reimagining it, we are also not able to make judgments about right and wrong, good and bad, about how we can live a good life when so much is bad around us. Second, utopia reassures us that another world is possible, that there are different routes out of our individual and collective conditions. As the Buddha learnt, behind the curtain of happiness drawn around him by his adoring parents lay a world that was marked by pain, illness, and death, as well as education, meditation, and renunciation. For the Buddha, a happy world was one where everyone followed dharma, the laws of social good, and where this right path led to nirvana, or the freedom from the cycle of rebirth. Being good, then, was the good life. Third, imagining another world also makes us struggle over resources that we might need to bring it into being. Rights to material goods as well as public political goods, individual as well as collective, capabilities that are honed and those that wither, are all to be struggled over for fairer distribution of these resources as that can underpin the good life. And finally, an alternative imaginary can provide us with a sense of belonging and of solidarity. The life of a citizen in the city-state, for Aristotle, was the life that was fulfilled. It involved activity exhibiting virtue in accordance with reason. It also involved the solidarity of mobilizing to protect the city and its inhabitants, the militarized and masculine citizenship solidarity. Those outside of this life, the slaves and women, were not thus fulfilled, however. So expanding solidarities also provides us with alternate visions of belonging, of redistribution of resources, power, and social roles. However, I would argue, although utopias have value, they are ever bounded by histories and geographies of inclusion and exclusion. And further, that our imaginaries are often articulated in narrow registers rather than the expansive ones that Hannah Arendt attributed to Walter Benjamin. He was concerned with the correlation between a street scene, a speculation on the stock exchange, a poem, a thought, with hidden line which holds them together and enables the historian or philologist to recognize that they must all be placed in the same period. It is these connections and associations, I would argue, across the boundaries of disciplines that can help us think through the good life. Whose good life? When we think of the good life, whose life are we thinking about? And whose life, and who is the agent of change? As Simone Weil puts it, to recognize the life of a human being is also then to recognize that at the bottom of the heart of every human being, from the earliest infancy till the tomb, there is something that goes on indomitably expecting, and I think that's really important to think through, in the teeth of all experience of crimes committed, suffered and witnessed, that good, not evil, will be done to him, obviously, and her. It is this, above all, that is sacred in every human being. The idea of the good life permeates most of our political thinking, either as individual strategies of maximizing our well-being, from the imaginings, as I've said, of the Buddha, to Smith and Bentham's utilitarian approach, Singer's theory of ethics of a good life, Kahneman's theory of happiness, or as institutional interventions to support the well-being of all groups that constitute our society. From Plato's laws that were to underpin the new city of Magnesia, from Marx, where the goal was to end exploitation and replace alienated labor with a life full of purpose rather than need, to Rawls, who cautions that multiple visions of the good life require state neutrality on key issues, and to Amartya Sen's work on the quality of life. Now, of course, feminist theorists have long critiqued a universalist impulse in political theory as privileging the male norm. Carol Hickman, for example, critiqued the social contract as sexual contract. Feminist scholars have also challenged the social separation upon which this norm is constructed, the private and the public, and have argued that the absence of insecurity and violence in both these spheres must surely be part of our conceptualizing of the good life. Again, to quote Weil, in those who have suffered too many blows, that place in the heart from which the infliction of evil evokes a cry of surprise may seem to be dead. But it is never quite dead. It is simply unable to cry out anymore. That is inevitable, because those who most often have occasion to feel that evil is being done to them are those who are least trained in the art of speech. So Spivak's thought of Candace of Alton speak also comes to mind here. The social anthropologist Shepard Hughes points out how deep injustices of political and economic inequality are manifested in women's emotional responses to childbearing, rearing, and mortality, specifically poor women's acceptance of their children's death. The sociologist Arjuna Badurai alerts us to the ways in which the capacity to aspire itself is located in our everyday exclusions. From early discussions of the exclusion of women from the public space and the incarceration in the private, to the work on how the state has been mobilized into stabilizing these carceral relations, to their particular and unequal inclusion in the productive spheres of international political economy, feminist and post-colonial work has vigorously challenged the discourse of universality of the human and hence of the good life. So what I'm arguing here is that the good life needs tethering in social conditions and relations, which is where issues of misrecognition and maldistribution become important. Nancy Fraser and Judith Butler have argued over the nature of capitalism, the injustices of distribution and recognition. Butler was insistent that Fraser's perspective or dualism allowed issues of recognition to be trumped by those of economic distribution, while Fraser insisted that within her framework, status order injuries as well as maldistribution injuries often go together. The underlying message of her formulation, however, was seen to be that economic structure trumps the social status injuries. Of course, recognition, I think, is critically important to our sense of well-being, both as individual subjects and as members of a social life where cruelties of misrecognition undermine sociality itself. Recognition is also important for us to think through what needs to be put in place for the enhancement of our life, not just its survival. The spaces of good life. Thinking about recognition and redistribution always reminds me of a story my father told me. He was a great walker and he loved to walk in the mountains, especially when we visited Shimla every summer. Shimla, of course, is the hill station and the summer capital of the British, getting away from the heat of Delhi. One day he came back from his usual morning walk, rather subdued, and this is what he related. "I've been taught a lesson today," he said. "I was sitting on the roadside bollards admiring the mountains when a coolie came and rested beside me. I turned to him and I asked, 'Aren't you a lucky man to live in Shimla? You have these mountains for companions all the time, while I'll be returning home to hot and dusty Delhi very soon.' He looked at me and said, 'Sahib, when do I get the time to lift up my head to see the mountains? I'm a coolie. I always look down to make sure I don't stumble.' My father's anger was with himself, about his own narrow understanding of beauty and who is able to reflect on it. He wanted me to remember this story, and I always have. Perhaps because of this, in my work, I too have been a bit of what Sarah Ahmed, I think, calls a feminist killjoy. Not raising my eyes to view the beauty of the mountain summit, the good life, but doggedly grappling with issues of exclusion and terms of inclusion, of labor and its framing, and of violence and its effects, the bad life. While I agree with Sarah Ahmed when she notes, and I quote, "Explanations of relative unhappiness can function to restore the power of an image of the good life in the form of nostalgia or regret for what has been lost," unquote, I would suggest that debates on relative unhappiness can also spur us on to action to move towards a shared good life. Much of my recent work has been on the non-recognition of domestic labor in society, by the state, and through regulatory mechanisms such as the system of national accounts that calculates our GDP. Marilyn Waring, who herself is a statistician and who worked for the UN, has this to say about the latter. "When you are seeking out the most vicious tools of colonization, those that can obliterate a culture and a nation, a tribe, or a people's value system, then rank the UNSNA among those tools." With my colleagues Catherine Hoskins and Dania Thomas, I analyzed the consequences of non-recognition as maldistribution by developing the concept of depletion through social reproduction. We all crave recognition of the work we do, to be able to access resources to restore ourselves through rest, sleep, leisure, medical attention when needed. Without this, we feel depleted. This depletion, built on unrecognized labor, can be harmful to individuals, adversely affecting their physical and mental health, to households, adversely affecting the relationships and material fabric of the home, and to the community through the erosion of public spaces accessed by all, as well as of solidaristic relations. It can also harm by generating a very different politics of citizenship, where those not recognized as workers in the home are also not recognized as citizens with entitlements against the state. Rather, they are constructed as recipients of welfare. Such depleted lives cannot be good lives. I did warn you about my killjoy tendencies, didn't I? But the principle of visualizing the good life through critiquing a bad life is, I think, an important one. Without joining the spaces of the domestic, private, and the public, we are only thinking about half the good life. By posing the question, whose good life, we can bring into light the hidden corners of the everyday where inequalities are reproduced and through which the good life of some is dependent upon the bad life of many. Roots to the good life. To imagine a good life in its complexities is also to think about how we can bring this good life into being. Searching for a utopia means also searching for the paths that lead to it. Here again, we find roots that are individual and ones that are more solidaristic. Viewing the individual as the object and the agent of visualization of a good life has a long history. In 5th century BCE Hindu philosophy, the good life is attained by living through 4 stages of, or ashrams as they're called, of the life of a man. Brahmacharya, or the student stage, where we focus on study and, wait for it, celibacy. Not our students, they don't. Grihastha, or the householder stage, when the head of household attained the means to provide for his family, wealth as well as values. Vanaprastha, or the hermit stage, the stage of retirement and passing on responsibilities of the family to the son. And sannyas, the wandering ascetic stage, the stage of renunciation and withdrawal from the world in preparation for death. Living this good life would lead to nirvana, escape from rebirth. Good life was then a contract with God. Order and discipline, acceptance rather than contestation are the promise of a good life elsewhere. Of course, I use the term, the words life of a man advisedly. Just as women and slaves were denied citizenship in Greek city-states, the life of education as well as reflection was not on offer for women in traditional Hindu society. Even though individual women like the poet Meera, for example, did rebel and pursue a life of education and sannyas. Equally outside the cycle of life were the lower castes, with Shudras, who are the lowest caste, only able to experience the householder stage with no resources to retire from work and family responsibilities. I think a modern manifestation of this might be what we might call the self-help industry now. I was looking this up and I was amazed to see that in the US alone, this self-improvement market, which has sort of, from the yoga sessions to self-help books to everything, was worth more than $9 billion in 2009 and rising. Is this, however, a good life? As Ahmed suggests, where we find the good life teaches us what we value rather than simply what is of value. Another more familiar strand of reaching the individual good life is, of course, that proposed by the liberal theorists such as Bentham and Mill, and most of all by Adam Smith. The shared good life is the result of individuals pursuing the good life through truck and barter in the market. Consumption then is the main route to happiness. The malls of London and Mumbai, of New York and New Delhi, and I just can't stand the ones in New Delhi because I didn't grow up with them, and they just make me not, I can't take any presents to my friends anymore because everything is available there and we keep on being told that. And yet, of course, Smith's work is much more complex than this. The poor man's son, whom heaven in its anger has visited with ambition, he writes, when he begins to look around him, admires the conditions of the rich. He finds the cottage of his father too small for his accommodation and fancies he should be lodged more at his case in a palace. It isn't until in the last dregs of life, his body wasted with toil and diseases, that he begins at last to find that wealth and greatness are mere trinkets of frivolous utility, no more adapted for procuring ease of body or tranquility of mind than the tweezer cases of the lover of toys. Justice, beneficence, and prudence were the virtues that would ensure the good life for Adam Smith. Social happiness is the effect of a natural arising morality, even though the individual might act morally for reasons other than the social good. However, given the Indian caste context, what I immediately think of is that while tranquility is a virtue, is it a virtue only for the rich? Can a poor man's son not be ambitious without coming to grief? This sounds very much like the Varna system which I've been talking about in Hindu philosophy, where those who keep their place and show no ambition to leave their station will receive rewards in terms of nirvana. Abhuddha is concerned that the capability to aspire is linked to the quality of life also comes to mind here. And what about the poor woman's daughter, one might ask? The altruism that is assumed where her labor is concerned sits uneasily next to a natural arising morality, where the double burden of work, the non-recognition of labor, and the gender segregated nature of work is factored in. And then there is Marx. Of course, he approached the good life from a historical materialist perspective, universal in its sweep of history's unfolding exploitation, class war leading to a utopia where famously a liberated society of the future would make it, and I quote, possible for me to do one thing today, another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have in mind, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic. Absent here also is a consideration of who will be doing the house chores when Marx or another man is hunting, fishing, shepherding, and critiquing. Securing the good life. Thinking about these individual and collective strategies to the good life also makes me think of what secures these. To think this through, let me return to my discussion of depletion, the bad life, and how to reverse it, securing the good life. Individual strategies of what we have called mitigation involve buying in labor of others to offset our own, so the market-based strategies of the good life. It's not, however, a shared vision of the good life. Indeed, it could be a relationship of exploitation with another. A second way of securing non-depleted lives can be through replenishment, where collective struggles for consolidating and expanding social protection and community networks can contribute to an understanding of and strategy towards bringing about a shared good life. So I'm involved in the PSA Commission on the Crisis of Care, which is addressing such issues of social protection in the context of this idea of social reproduction. The third way to reverse depletion we term transformation, which involves structural change, fundamentally in transforming gender-social relations such that both men and women equally share social reproductive responsibilities, with social provisions made to reflect this across private and public spheres. So struggles for transforming these arenas have been ongoing. Of course, I don't think that tomorrow we'll have a revolution, right? But if we take a bundle of changes that maybe add up to transformation in the long term, then we may see some elements of that transformation emerging through these struggles for gender equality and the valuation of social reproduction. Many of these struggles, I think, are therefore, if we think about replenishment as really where we are now, directed at the state. Despite our critiques of government, governance and the law, contemporary struggles to attain equality, non-discrimination and democratic parity have been focused on these institutions. Recognition, redistribution and development of capabilities of citizens are in democratic politics connected to fair representation, holding the state and governance institutions accountable, and to improving delivery mechanisms for policies directed towards achieving these goals. So according to Ostrom, for example, the concept of a civil society outside of a governed society is difficult to accept. It seems to me, she writes, that the problem of achieving a good society is not to move outside of government. So this brings me to the second strand of my work on women's representation in political life. Anne Phillips has pointed out that the, and I quote, persistent underrepresentation of women in most of the forms of forums in which issues of public life are addressed emerges as a particularly pressing problem, unquote. It is pressing because different notions of the good life find particular articulation, and these articulations are represented in public life, institutional and informal, in different modes, with different outcomes. It is also pressing because institutional exclusions don't result in an inclusive, It is also pressing because institutional exclusions don't result in inclusive social policies. In this context, the evidence across the world suggests, and in India we are having huge sort of battles about this, that a significant increase in representation of women and other marginalized categories will need special state-supported measures such as quotas. Even though quotas in themselves are of course not sufficient measures to increase participation in public life, for which we need a politics, institutional, discursive and symbolic, that supports a good life for all. However, in order to support a shared good life, institutional development needs to be analyzed in context. The links between access to power structures, participation in decision-making, and achieving a gender balance between men and women in political institutions needs to be made and struggled over in the context of the political economy in which these institutions are embedded. And that is why my work, I've been working on trying to build a bridge between issues of depletion and issues of representation. Finally, I think securing the good life in terms of recognition and redistribution also means paying attention to difference. Can feminist futures be unmarked by the internal critique of feminism on grounds of struggles over recognition of difference? Erasures of race and culture in the stories of feminist theory make possible through a series of ontological and epistemological maneuvers which structure the emergence of a common sense regarding the boundaries of the known and knowable, and make alliances across these boundaries difficult. From working class women's and black feminist challenges to global feminism in the 70s, to the cultural difference debates of the 1990s, difference has vexed feminist theory and practice in productive and less fruitful ways. While the earlier optimistic readings of women's solidarity had folded in differences among them, many have argued that the cultural turn of the 90s led to a hands-off approach to culture and equality, which meant that most dialogue across these boundaries ceased to animate feminist work. I also personally worry about this because I feel a hesitancy from talking about certain issues. For example, when I did some work on honor crimes, or when I think about debates on FGM. I feel worried about the reading that my work will generate in those outside the cultural boundaries within which these crimes take place, while at the same time recognizing the importance of breaking the codes of silence that racism imposes, something that most people of color experience. As Geeta Chowdhury and I have argued, we have not yet been able to develop the vocabularies that would allow us to speak confidently and respectfully across these borders of difference. And yet, reimagining the good life and struggling to make it real needs precisely that, a new politics of solidarity. Solidarity. Bloch has argued that utopia was a form of cultural surplus, in the world but not of it. It contains, he says, the spark that reaches out beyond the surrounding emptiness. Lighting the spark and making change happen involves agency, both as resistance and as solidarity. However, exercising agency also attracts risks, both, especially as Rahel Jaggi argues, in conditions of deficit of social cooperation that can result in situations of social alienation. Sumi Madhok and I have countered the tendency to view agency as an attribute of the individual who, in the words of Wendy Brown, bears full responsibility for the consequences of his or her action, no matter how severe the constraints on this action, quote unquote. Struggles for change, we argue, do not unfold in individualist, ahistorical, universalist, and acontextual frames. They do so in specific contexts, in languages that are laden with histories, and through agency that is framed by risk. While not acting might prolong social injury, strategizing for change needs to involve attention to the parameters of power within which agential subjects seek to act. Here also, the good life cannot be realized if the costs of its realization are too high for too many. After all, we don't want to be thinking about tragedies, but positive outcomes. Solidarity, I would say, can be a defense against such costs. For Durkheim, solidarity was what prevents the breakdown of societies. For Marx, it was class reflexivity translated into political action against exploitation. For feminists, it has been at times global sisterhood and at others solidarity in difference. Solidarity has also been visualized as one standing for others and others standing in for one. So, solidarity is not therefore beneficence and charity. It is a more symmetrical relationship among those whose vision of a good life coalesce around similar forms of politics. It militates against what Giraud calls the sheer weight of the apocalypse. But is also reflexive. It illuminates practices of power that work within different ideological and institutional relations of domination, but it also critiques itself as a particular type of practice in which men and women challenge oppressive and dominating institutions. Take, for example, the slut walks as a campaign to challenge the denial of public spaces to women, or the Why Loiter campaign, which is doing the same for women in India. According to Sharon Welch, solidarity is the opposite of indifference. To remember the reality of oppression, she says, in the lives of people and to value those lives is to be saved from the luxury of hopelessness. Even as individual strategies of leaving violent worlds behind makes refugees in Europe vulnerable to new violent words of hate and rejection, we need to think what solidarity might do for them as well as for us. After all, although there have been many who have waved flags that say, in the words of the poet Vasram Shair, "Go home, blacks, refugees, dirty immigrants, asylum seekers, sucking our country dry," there have also been some who have been giving the arriving refugees a hand, bread and water, warmth and support, solidarity in short. Through developing such solidarity, through standing with others in struggle defined by historical processes to develop concrete forms of sociality, we can develop what Welch calls a redeemed community. Solidarity with the oppressed, then, can help us towards a good life for ourselves. We, as intellectuals, educators, can participate in developing this solidarity. We can do this through reflecting on our curricula, our pedagogy, our conferences, our writing, and the spaces that we are ready to occupy. A group of academics from the University of East London, for example, have been teaching refugees in Calais, even as the camps there are being dismantled by the French government. Teachers have been conducting teach-ins at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, challenging the appropriation of nationalism by the current government in a bid to delegitimize the student movement. Such acts of everyday solidarity can help bridge the private and the public, the individual and the collective, as well as challenge the dichotomies of knowledge power. By uncovering forms of historical and subjugated knowledges that point to experiences of suffering, conflict, and collective struggle, Giraud argues, teachers as intellectuals can begin to link the notion of historical understanding to elements of critique and hope. So, in conclusion, in doing so, we place ourselves in relation to the social that we critique, the individual that we nurture in our classrooms, and the political that we seek to reform in pursuit of the good life. Thank you.